You've got questions, we've got answers.
And I think that makes your pathway to university a lot easier.
The brain,
especially the first year if you pick the right subjects in year 11 and 12.
Information.
Here, and those signals run down through the spine.
Here in our studio, we'll be bringing you the answer to these questions and more. Join us for InfoMate. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of InfoMate. On today's program, we'll be talking about the current state of the property market in Sydney, and along with the trends and developments of the business centres that are popping around everywhere in New South Wales. On today's program, I have the pleasure of being joined by Associate Professor Dr. Garrett Small. Thank you very much for joining us today, Garrett.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I've been in the property industry since the early 1970s,
Wow.
So I've seen a few booms and busts and also a fair bit of change around Sydney. I describe myself as spending the first half of my working life trying to get out of Sydney, and I'm a failure. I'm still here. But I have seen a lot of changes in the city. I was working in development for, I guess, about 20 years, and then I moved into academia. So I've been working as a lecturer, now associate professor, in the property economics area.
Okay.
So my students are property developers, property valuers, basically anyone who takes an interest in the property market.
What prompted the change from the industry to the teaching side of things?
It was partly because I was could see that there was more to property than I was aware of.
Okay.
Working on the ground.
Yeah.
In that I was working in places like Quakers Hill,
Yep.
when that was still paddocks.
Yep.
Now that's old houses, and there was something mysterious about the way that I would go in, and at that stage I was on the engineering side.
Yep.
And
So it's been able to broaden your horizons, I guess.
yeah, and see the commercial value of property.
Yep.
That really strips well and truly away from the actual physical construction. So being an academic gives me the opportunity to look behind the scenes and actually work out what's going on. I always wanted to work out what was behind the capital gains in land.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent. So you'd be able to tell us a bit about what's happening in the current market in Sydney.
What we're seeing right now in the current market is pretty much the top of a cycle.
Yep.
Now, property people will talk about the property market going through an 8 to 10 year cycle typically. Mm-hmm. And so we had good times around just before the global financial crisis, 2006, 2007. So now we're about 10 years later. And so a lot of people would say, well, that's just what happens. I think there's a lot more to it than that, because there must be a cause. Why does the sun come up? Yep. And so understanding those causes are important. There are a number of people who would have been saying the property market is overheated, prices are too high, like a couple of years ago, and everyone's saying, no, this is wonderful, it's going to continue. And of course now we're getting most of the commentators saying that in the next 12 months or so, property in Sydney is probably going to go down by a modest amount.
What are we expecting it to go down?
Currently, the commentators are ranging from modest suggestions like about 5 or 10%,
yep,
to somewhere a lot more significant. And so if you want to say something really radical, you can say 50, 100% or something. Yeah. But no. Realistically, probably 20 or 30% would be the worst of the worst, and it's relatively unlikely.
Yep. But
it is possible. Around the fall in property that happened at the end of the 1980s,
yep,
89, 90, different parts of the property market fell by between 20 and 30%.
Wow. So what are some of the causes for these significant drops?
Largely because property's value is to a certain extent artificially supported by the conditions that it sells for.
Okay.
Right? And that largely comes down to how much money a bank is lending to the community.
Okay.
Right? If you and I go into an auction room, the bank gives you $100,000, gives me $100,000, and let's say we've got $100,000 in the bank already.
Okay.
You and I can both bid $200,000. Right?
Yep.
If they give us $1 million each, we'll both go in, and we'll both bid to 1.1.
Yep.
Right? Now, what's changed there? It's still a little old house, but it's because the society has this confidence, as reflected in the bank's willingness to lend. Now, young people today are considering themselves fortunate if they're only borrowing $500,000. It takes a long time to save up $500,000, and a lot of them are borrowing a lot more. When I first started taking interest in the property market, to go to the bank for, let's say, $20,000 or $30,000 was a huge amount of money.
Okay.
Now, admittedly, I'm an old bloke, but still that kind of relativity is coming through. When the banks decide that they're lending too much to too many people, interest rates will go up, or some other method of rationing the money.
Yes,
and so when we go into an auction and now I've only got $500,000 in my pocket and you've still got the million, well, the property prices will come back down to reflect that.
Yeah.
And that's largely what we're going to be seeing, I think.
Is that what we're finding now, with the banks a bit more afraid to lend?
That's what we're largely seeing, and it's expressed in terms of caution. Banks are very risk adverse.
Yep.
The whole thing about being a banker is that you want to make money without taking any risk at all if you can.
Yeah.
You want to be able to have so much certainty that you're going to get all of your principal and interest back, so that you're really making a pure profit without really being involved in the risks of the enterprise.
So all those people who've bought at the top of the market, you know, they bought it last year, the year before, they've paid premium prices for these houses they're living in. Do they have anything to be concerned about if the market's going down?
In the long term, they probably won't, but in the short term, they'll probably feel a bit unhappy, and they'll probably find that, you know, compared to other people, you know, their personal standard of living is going to be lower because they're going to be paying the higher mortgages. Yeah. Now, this is a lot milder than what's happened in other countries, say, you know, 10 years ago during the global financial crisis, where people found that the property value, say in the United States or parts of Europe, Iceland, their property values fell so far that they owed more to the bank by a long way than the house was worth.
Okay.
Now at that point, what do you do? And that can be really devastating because, you know, your life saving is gone. You know, it can be quite devastating.
Okay.
Now that hasn't happened in Australia so much. It has happened in some, you know, to a certain extent. But
so over the long term, we just got to sort of ride that cycle out.
We hope so. Now this is with the optimist hat on.
Okay.
It could be that it may take a fair while. When we're talking about Sydney, if we were to extend our gaze to all of, say, New South Wales, you would find that many parts of New South Wales, especially the smaller centres, their property prices haven't really gone up very much in a long time, and they've been on a downward trend for a long time.
This could be out somewhere in the country, for example. Yeah.
That's right. Cities, say, less than 20,000 people, even some larger country cities have had that happening over the long term. Now, of course, you know, go back to your question, what happens if I bought at the top of the market and I'm in, let's say, I won't name the cities because it could be embarrassing for the residents there, but you sort of find 20 years later the house is still worth, you know, maybe less than when you bought it, or about the same, and your mates down in Sydney or Brisbane or Melbourne, you know, they're millionaires now. You know, you do feel sour, but it is a little bit of a bet. It's because we're looking at real estate more and more today like an investment rather than as a place to live.
Okay.
You know,
are you finding any proportions between the people who are looking at it as an investment and those wanting to be homeowners or live there?
It's an interesting question. The number of investors has been rising in recent times. Now, recent really is probably maybe the last generation almost.
Okay.
That the percentage of investors was rising from the 1980s, and it has been kind of creeping up. And likewise, we can look at the levels of home ownership in terms of owner-occupiers. So the idea of buying a house in order to live in it for your family, they're now becoming less of a percentage in the community compared to investors, and even a lot of young people.
Yep.
You know, it was once a time when you'd, you know, be maybe in the early 20s, you'd sort of finish your studies and you'd be thinking about getting married and buying a house to settle down with. Now, the same person may or may not be thinking about getting married, but often they'll be looking at getting their first house as an investment. So they'll still be living with mum and dad.
Yeah.
Now, that's a completely different mentality to
What it used to be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of housing has stopped being something that I do for my family. It's now something that I do to get rich.
It's a bit of a change, because you do find the younger people living with their parents a lot longer just so they can continue to have an investment property that they can then flip at a later stage and try and come out with a heads up.
That's right.
But they look at that from that stage where if they want to buy something, especially over the last few years in Sydney, well, you know, do you need $500,000? Do you need $1 million? Whatever the case may be, because they need that significant amount of startup capital or a deposit. They're trying to work out whatever they can to skimp costs, and that usually ends up living with mum and dad for a little while longer, doesn't it?
It's inevitable. That's right.
Yeah.
We have to live somewhere.
Yep.
And that's an important human reality. It's also, to a certain extent, the power of the market. There's something like almost 1,000 people moving into Sydney every week.
Wow.
Every week.
Every week.
Right? And so when we look around here and see all the houses going up, you say, well, you know, what's going to do with those? Well, that's the 1,000 people. Right? This week, next week, you know, so there's a lot of people moving into Sydney. People in Sydney tend to have smaller families.
Yep.
So we're not actually reproducing naturally, but we're relying on people that are coming from overseas or maybe regional Australia. So families tend to be a lot larger in the country, partly because people can't afford to have families.
Yeah.
If you're living, again, in the smaller areas, or even in places like Wagga or Dubbo,
Yep.
and certainly in small areas where real estate is more affordable.
It's a bit scary how the place that you live actually dictates the type of lifestyle that you'll have, how many kids you might have, what you end up doing in the evenings or afternoons. It seems to be sort of the wrong way around today.
That's leading on to, another topic that in some ways, when as a community we swapped our houses from being places to live in to places to invest in, then exactly what you say is almost the necessary conclusion. That if, as a community, we're all thinking, you know, I want to have nappies sort of hanging on the clothesline, to I want an investment property, the whole dynamics changes. And you know, we build different types of real estate, and of course the banks look at it in a different way. Now I'm going along to the bank saying I'm going to have rent plus my spare income to service this loan, so the loan's going to be bigger, and again the market goes up, and I'm looking more to the buy and selling. So the young people that you're describing before, almost because they're applying the wisdom that they obtained from their parents when the dynamics were different, they're applying a strategy which unfortunately is actually continuing the problem.
Okay.
Because by getting the investment property, they're pushing the prices up, and they're the prices that they can't afford to live in the hope that they'll be able to get ahead of the game far enough.
Yeah.
So it's a complex thing.
It is. Now, even on your drive in, you would have noticed some of the changes. You were talking about Schofields Road when you drove in, and how you noticed the changes there. Can you describe how it is you've noticed the changes in the Sydney market over the last 10, 15 years?
Sure enough. I think the big change in Sydney's mentality is more towards higher density living, and that's one of the things about coming out here, that seeing a lot more of the houses on blocks. But even then, what we're seeing is a larger percentage of like the townhouse, connected houses. Yep. The idea of having a freestanding cottage is now becoming uncommon. We still do it to a certain extent, but it's kind of a luxury item almost, whereas most people see themselves as a duplex, two houses stuck together, or a row. So we're getting that higher density. I think architecturally we're moving all the time to cheaper. Yep. Now, that leads us into one of the curiosities of property, and that is that having a cheap house doesn't necessarily give you an inexpensive house, because most of the cost of your real estate is in the land.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's only so far you can go in, if I use cheaper materials or thinner walls or do whatever, while that will have a temporary advantage.
Yep.
it doesn't make the land any cheaper.
No.
And the odd thing in the long term is it tends to make the land more expensive. In that if I start off spending, I don't know, $100,000 on a house and able to buy the land for $100,000, if I make the house $50,000 and I've still got the capacity to spend $200 on my property,
Yep.
what happens to the land?
What does happen? It goes up.
Goes up.
Yeah.
So I still end up buying my house for $200,000, but now I've got the little ticky-tack house that's going to fall down very shortly.
Yep.
It's only worth $30,000, $50,000.
Yep.
And the land has now just absorbed that extra.
Yeah.
And again, when we look around, and a good example for anyone who's interested is look at the difference between, say, an old house, an old small, let's say, a fibro house.
Yep.
May not, you can see that's not very valuable, but look at its value compared to the house next door, and you think, well, how much more would the house next door? It might be just brand new brick.
Yep.
It won't be the lion's share of the value.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
the value's in the land itself.
Absolutely.
And what have you noticed about block sizes or land sizes over time as well? They seem to be shrinking as time goes along, you know, trying to squeeze more and more homes onto the same footprint.
That's right. The curious thing there is that it's a curious place where the two polar opposites of, if you like, the political ideologies that we normally live with.
Okay.
You know, left and right, Labor and Liberal, have communist or socialist and capitalist, right?
Yep.
They both join together to conspire against people who want a backyard. Right? The people on the left would say urban sprawl, that's a bad thing, environmentally it's a bad thing, we'll have to get people to live closer together to save the environment. Right? The developers, on the other hand, who generally sort of be on the right side of the political spectrum, they'd say, well, I've got 5 acres to develop. Before I could maybe do 20 houses.
Yep.
Now I can do 50 houses. And so they'll be very, very friendly with the left wingers. And so to a certain extent, the left and the right are both conspiring against the ordinary man. And so one way or another, we don't have, if you like, a political party or a voice for the ordinary small family or the ordinary small person.
Okay. And then in these developments that we're getting everywhere, so what are some of the trends of getting a business park developed in some of these areas? Is there any science or theories behind that?
Business parks and also shopping complexes are both attempts to have more affordable commercial land.
Okay.
Right? And you think about it, the traditional approach is that if you have a town that grows up, in the middle of that town there will be the shops and the offices and the government departments and all that sort of thing. Now, what's happened over time is that at first, especially with communication improvements and to a certain extent the motor car, people were discovering that, say, the CBD of Sydney was far too expensive.
Yep.
Right? And so they were moving as many of their people out to an industrial area, really cheap real estate. And so you have the industrial area starting to look like offices because with electronic communication and so on, they could be doing most of the work. So this is for, say, the head office of an insurance company or something like that.
Yep.
But it could be a government department, it could be anything. So what was happening was that the CBDs were no longer affordable for business. And so they went out to the industrial areas. And before you know it, the industrial areas were looking more like office parks.
Yep.
And so the whole idea of a business park started off as this escape from the overpriced CBDs, whether it's Parramatta or the Sydney CBD. Yep. And so you end up with that kind of a trend.
Okay. And then, so do we find that the business parks come around housing developments, or that housing developments come around business parks?
Can go either way.
Yep.
In a sense, they're the new CBDs.
Yep.
If a CBD is largely identified with employment. Now, on the other hand, we can have shopping centres. And again, they used to be in the middle of town. So if you'd want to go to buy a meal or have your teeth fixed or whatever, you go to the middle of town, right?
Yeah,
now you might go out to a Westfield or a Stocklands or something, which might be wide out and they're never somewhere. A good example of this would be, say, Macquarie Park.
Yeah.
So you've got a business park and you've got Macquarie Centre, shopping centre. The shopping centre, where did it come from? right? It was just a cheap, out-of-the-way place, but they built this magnificent place to shop.
Yep.
So people stopped going to shop in Epping or, many places around because they were willing to go to this, really.
I suppose the theory that it's got everything, one-stop shop.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So does these business parks, commercial centres, CBDs outside of Sydney, do these add to the value of the people's houses around that area?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always convenient to live close to work and close to where your kids are going to school, close to the shops that you need.
Okay.
And so property values do come as a result of the strength of your community.
Yep.
And I guess what I would be typically telling my students would be look for population growth and economic strength. Now, if you have a business park, you're really doing both of those things. You're providing an employment centre. A lot of services are in business parks. Again, there's be things like medical services and so on like that.
Okay. And what are some of the future developments that come around these areas? Are we talking other infrastructure that gets built up around business parks?
You do need a complete society. So you need all of the services a community needs. And I mentioned schools, but also hospitals, places of worship that we can talk about. Basically everything that the community needs. In town planning terms, one of the concerns a lot of town planners have is that a lot of the way that we're developing is suited towards the motor car.
Yeah.
If we were living, say, in a more traditional situation, say in Europe or any part of the world, Asia anyway, because transport used to be either public transport or walking, you would have village as the centre. But now we can have something where people, hop in a car and drive for an hour and think that's comfortable.
Yeah.
But once you provide employment and services for people, then people want to live there. So your house will become more valuable. And of course, as more people live in an area, then the business park is going to become more valuable.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of an interaction there.
Yeah, and the more people want to come there, more development in the area goes in the same spot. So what happens if you've got a place of worship in a business park? Can you tell us a bit about the dynamic there? Sure.
There have been a number of empirical studies done in the United States on Christian churches.
Yep.
And they showed quite a repeatable trend of value kind of going up, especially within, in the studies I'm familiar with, within a few kilometres, particularly within walking distance, so within about 2 kilometres.
Yep.
Now, that's an advantage depending on whether you're immediately in the area. Like anything else, a place of worship is something that people value being able to get to as a part of the most important things in their life. It could be a hospital, it could be a school. The strength of that association is very much on the demand.
Yeah.
So maybe a school is probably a fair parallel. If you have boys and there's a girls' school nearby, it's not going to make very much of a difference, right? But if it's the other way around, obviously it's going to have a bit of an impact. I think with the mosque, one of the advantages is that it's going to lift property prices nearby.
Yep.
I guess the long-term disadvantage could be that people who want to come and attend the mosque for prayers at some point may be priced out of it simply because of its own success.
Yep.
Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen likely, but if you like, there's a tendency for that success becoming a failure in a sense.
Okay.
But it's still attractive, and once you bought the property, then feel good about it. So it's usually what we talk about.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. Thank you, Garrett.
Thank you.
As we've discussed today, the Sydney market is currently at the top end of a property cycle and is moving into a downward trend. All the development in the area, however, will have a long-term or should have a long-term positive effect in the general Sydney area. Thanks very much for watching. We look forward to bringing you another program from MTA International Australia Studios. Jazakumullah and Khudafis.